They said she was a geologist, sent to study rocks in a war zone. They called her the Rookie, a civilian anomaly in the rigid world of forward operating base Nightingale. They watched her trace the lines in the stone with a detached reverence, and they mocked her uselessness. They were wrong. They learned that some people do not come to study the world, but to command it. They learned that the geologist was not there to read the history written in the canyon walls, but to write its final chapter with a single, impossible shot. They learned that a law of physics had been given a human form, and they had mistaken her for a target of scorn. The air in the Xylos Canyon was a physical weight. It was old air, trapped between the towering granite and basalt walls that clawed at a mercilessly white sky. It tasted of pulverized rock, ozone from the humming perimeter fence, and the faint, metallic tang of fear. FOB Nightingale sat in the gut of this geological leviathan, a carbuncle of sand-colored HESCO barriers and antennas that seemed an affront to the silent, billion-year-old stone. The heat was a predator, stalking the slivers of shadow, and the silence was its accomplice. It was a coiled, watchful thing, broken only by the rhythmic thrum of the base's primary generator and the distant, almost subliminal hum of wind moving through the high passes. Dr. Alara Vance felt the canyon's resonance in the bones of her feet. To the soldiers who watched her, she was a curiosity, a slight figure in sterile, unadorned fatigues who spent her days not with a rifle, but with a suite of sensors that looked like arcane instruments of survey. They saw her standing for hours before a sheer rock face, her fingers tracing the feldspar intrusions, her eyes distant. They saw a civilian, a rookie out of her depth, a liability. They did not see the complex cascade of data spooling through her mind. She felt the microfractures in the granite beneath the base, cataloged the harmonic frequencies of the wind as it interacted with different strata of rock, and mapped the way seismic vibrations propagated through the canyon's floor. The canyon was not just a place to her. It was a system, a complex acoustic chamber with its own rules, its own language, and she was learning to speak it. Her workspace was an alcove in the Tactical Operations Center, a space grudgingly ceded to her by the base commander. It was a sterile island in a sea of controlled chaos. Her monitors displayed not troop movements or drone feeds, but seismographic data, acoustic modeling software, and geological subsurface scans. The data flowed in elegant, undulating lines of green and amber, a language only she understood. She saw the canyon's soul laid bare in the numbers. She could predict the time of day a rock slide was most likely to occur a dozen kilometers up the pass, based on thermal expansion rates in the gneiss formations. She knew the precise resonant frequency that would carry a whisper from one side of the canyon to the other, as if the speaker were standing right beside you. Her work was quiet, methodical, and to the uniformed men around her, utterly incomprehensible. The door to the TOC slammed open, a violent sound that shattered the delicate equilibrium of the air. Major Kalen Thorne strode in, his presence a blast furnace of kinetic energy and unearned certainty. He was a man carved from the template of command, broad shoulders, a jaw that seemed perpetually clenched, and eyes that saw the world as a series of obstacles to be overcome with overwhelming force. His uniform was crisp, his insignia polished to a mirror shine, a stark contrast to Vance's functional, rankless attire. He moved with the heavy tread of a man who believed his authority was a physical law, as immutable as gravity. He surveyed the room, his gaze sweeping over the comms technicians and intelligence analysts before landing, as it always did, on Vance's secluded corner. A sneer ghosted across his lips. He walked over, his boots striking the metal floor with deliberate, percussive impacts that grated on her nerves. The seismic sensors she had placed under the floorboards registered his approach as a series of jarring, asymmetrical spikes. He was a disruption in the data, an anomaly of pure ego. He stopped beside her console, looming over her, casting a shadow that fell across her screens. He did not look at the complex data streams. He looked past them, at her, his eyes narrowed with the casual disdain of a man who equated silence with weakness. He smelled of stale coffee and self-regard. "Still playing with your rocks, specialist?" The title was a deliberate insult, a reminder of her nebulous non-combatant status. He used the word specialist like it was a pejorative, a term for something strange and probably useless. Vance did not look up. Her focus remained on a particularly intricate waveform analysis. She was tracking the decay of a seismic echo from a scheduled supply drone landing 3 kilometers away. The echo was behaving strangely, refracting off a subsurface anomaly she hadn't fully mapped yet. It was a puzzle, and Thorne was a distraction. A loud, predictable, and irritating distraction. "It's geological resonance analysis, Major," she replied, her voice a low monotone, devoid of inflection. She did not give him the satisfaction of her attention. His jaw tightened. Her refusal to engage on his terms, to show the requisite deference, was a constant source of irritation to him. He leaned closer, planting a hand on her desk, his knuckles white. The impact sent another sharp spike through her sensors. "And what, precisely, is the tactical value of geological resonance analysis in a combat zone? Are you going to tell me if the enemy is hiding any particularly interesting fossils? This is a forward operating base, not a university field trip." His voice was a blunt instrument, designed to hammer subordinates into compliance. The other soldiers in the TOC studiously ignored the exchange, their focus on their own screens suddenly absolute. They had seen this before. Now, she turned her head, slowly. Her eyes, a pale, dispassionate gray, met his. There was no fear in them, no anger. There was only a calm, clinical assessment. She saw the slight tremor in his hand, the faint sheen of sweat on his brow, despite the climate-controlled air of the TOS. She registered his elevated heart rate in the subtle pulse of a vein in his neck. He was a system running hot, inefficient, and prone to error. "The canyon is not solid, Major," she stated, her voice as flat and cool as the data on her screen. "It is a lattice of fractures, voids, and differing densities. Sound and vibration do not travel through it in a straight line. They reflect, refract, and deceive. Understanding that is understanding the terrain. It is the most fundamental tactical data we have." Thorne scoffed, a harsh, grating sound. He straightened up, puffing out his chest. "The only tactical data I care about comes from a 5.56 round impacting a target. The only terrain I need to understand is what's in my rifle scope. You are a civilian contractor, a geologist, brought in on some high-level experimental program that command refuses to explain. As far as I'm concerned, you are a waste of resources and a distraction to my soldiers. Stay out of the way." He didn't wait for a response. He had delivered his decree. He turned on his heel and marched toward the central command dais. The matter settled in his mind. Vance watched him go. She cataloged his threat display, his reliance on volume and rank to assert dominance. It was a primitive, inefficient method of communication. She turned back to her screen. The refracted seismic echo was still there, a faint, lingering question mark in the deep, silent stone. She isolated the waveform, tagged it for further analysis, and continued her work. The major was a variable, but the canyon was the constant, and the canyon was speaking. She just needed to keep listening. The first shell arrived without warning. It was not the familiar, gut-thumping crump of a standard mortar or the shrieking descent of conventional artillery. It was a sound that broke the laws of physics. A sharp, cracking report echoed from the canyon walls, seemingly from every direction at once, a sonic mirage that confused the senses. A fraction of a second later, the west perimeter wall erupted in a geyser of dirt and shredded steel. The concussive blast wave hit the talk like a physical blow, rattling the walls and sending coffee cups skittering off consoles. Alarms blared, a cacophony of electronic shrieks that replaced the stunned silence. "Report!" Thorne bellowed, already grabbing a handset, his face a mask of furious energy. "West wall! We have an impact! Get me a direction! Counter battery, now!" The comms channels exploded with panicked, contradictory reports. "Source unknown! The sound came from the North Pass!" Another voice cried. "Negative! It came from the East Ridge! I saw the flash!" A third insisted. "It was directly overhead. High angle of attack." Vance's hands flew across her keyboard. She wasn't listening to the voices. She was watching the data. Her seismic sensors had registered the impact, a massive, brutal spike of energy. But the initial firing event, it was wrong. It wasn't a single, clean point of origin. It was a smeared, chaotic mess, a ghost signal that seemed to ripple out from the very rock of the canyon itself. The acoustic sensors were even more useless, showing multiple phantom sources, echoes of echoes that painted a picture of an enemy that was everywhere and nowhere at once. Another impossible crack echoed through the canyon, and a second shell slammed into the motor pool, turning a supply truck into a blossom of fire and black smoke. The base's automated defense turrets swiveled wildly, their targeting systems utterly baffled by the phantom acoustic signatures. They fired blindly into the rock walls, their tracers ricocheting uselessly into the sky. "Damn it!" Thorne roared, slamming his fist on the holographic map table. "Where is it coming from? Air support, I want eyes in the sky now. Scour every inch of these cursed rocks." A young lieutenant, face pale, spoke up. "Sir, the acoustic triangulation is failing. The echoes, they're creating ghost signatures. The system thinks we're being fired on from a dozen different locations." "Then use your eyes," Thorne snapped, his composure beginning to fray. "Find the muzzle flash." Vance knew they wouldn't. She was cross-referencing the seismic data with her geological maps. The enemy wasn't just using the canyon for cover. They were using its very structure as a weapon. They had found a resonance chamber, a natural geological amphitheater that captured the sound of their weapon, amplified it, and scattered it, turning a single gunshot into a symphony of confusion. It was brilliant, it was elegant, and it was deadly. The third shell hit the communications array. The primary dish folded in on itself with a groan of tortured metal, and half the screens in the talk went to static. They were being dismantled, piece by piece, with surgical precision. The enemy was a ghost, a phantom with a cannon, and Thorne's conventional warfare playbook was utterly useless against it. He was trying to fight an enemy he couldn't locate, using tools that were being actively deceived by the environment itself. He ordered a full salvo from the base's own artillery, a desperate brute force response. The shells screamed out, impacting on the East Ridge where one of the phantom flashes had been reported. The explosions were thunderous, but Vance watched the seismic readouts. The enemy weapon fired again while the friendly shells were still in the air. This time, the infirmary was hit. The attack was methodical, cold. The failure of orthodoxy was absolute. Thorne's reliance on technology and established doctrine had been turned against him. The triangulation systems were useless. The air support, when it finally arrived, could see nothing, their thermal and optical sensors scanning kilometers of empty, sun-baked rock. Thorne was shouting orders that had no effect, his authority bleeding away with every new impact. He was a man trying to punch a ghost. The talk was a pressure cooker of fear and confusion. The men and women who had moved with such crisp efficiency just minutes before were now hesitant, their faith in their commander visibly eroding. Amidst the rising tide of panic, Vance was an island of absolute calm. She had filtered out the noise, the shouting, the explosions. She was focused on one thing, the anomalous seismic echo she had tagged earlier. It was there again, a faint, repeating signature buried beneath the chaos of the impacts. It was not the firing event itself. It was something else, a harmonic tremor, a sympathetic vibration induced in a specific type of rock by the weapon's discharge. It was weak, almost imperceptible, but it was consistent, and it was coming from only one place. She ran a correlation analysis, layering the seismic data over her subsurface geological maps. The pieces clicked into place with the cold, hard certainty of a mathematical proof. The enemy was not on a ridge or in a pass. They were inside the canyon wall itself, in a cave system hidden behind a massive formation of schist, a type of metamorphic rock riddled with mica. The mica flakes were acting like millions of tiny acoustic mirrors, absorbing and scattering the direct sound of the weapon, while the main concussive force was channeled through the bedrock, creating the phantom echoes. The harmonic tremor she was detecting was the unique vibrational signature of the schist formation itself, resonating like a tuning fork every time the weapon fired. They were blind, they were deaf, and she could see. The moment of collective paralysis arrived with the fifth shell, which struck the main munitions depot. A secondary explosion, a terrifying, deep-throated roar, shook the entire base, buckling the floor plates of the TOC. The lights flickered and died, and the room was plunged into the blood-red gloom of the emergency lighting. The holographic map table sputtered, its image dissolving into static. For a full 3 seconds, the only sound was the ringing in their ears and the distant crackle of fire. It was the sound of utter defeat. Thorne stood frozen, his face illuminated in the hellish red light, his expression one of slack-jawed disbelief. His system had failed. His authority was a hollow shell. His world had crumbled. Into that void, a single, quiet voice spoke. "I have a firing solution." Every head in the room turned. Ilara Vance had risen from her chair. She had moved to the center of the room, her small frame seeming to draw all the remaining light towards it. Her face was calm, her eyes clear and focused. She was no longer a geologist. She was an instrument of precision in a room full of broken tools. Thorne stared at her as if seeing her for the first time. The fog of his rage and panic was momentarily pierced by sheer astonishment. "What did you say?" he whispered, his voice hoarse. "I know where they are," Vance stated, her voice cutting through the tension. It held no triumph, no, "I told you so." It was a simple declaration of fact. She pointed not to the dead holographic table, but to a paper topographical map pinned to a wall, one she had annotated with her own geological markings. Her finger landed on a sector designated 3 Gamma, an area of sheer, unremarkable cliff face 5 kilometers to the northwest. They are here, inside the rock, in a cavern system approximately 30 meters behind this formation of micaceous schist. A ripple of disbelief went through the room. "That's impossible," the artillery lieutenant stammered. "That's a solid rock wall. There's no cave marked on any survey." "The surveys are incomplete," Vance said, her gaze unwavering. "They map the surface, not the internal structure. I'm not guessing. The weapon's discharge is causing a sympathetic harmonic resonance in the schist. It's a seismic fingerprint. It is unique, and it is unambiguous. It is coming from that exact location." Thorne found his voice, a snarl of desperate incredulity. "A fingerprint? We're getting blown to pieces and you're talking about rock vibrations? We can't get a direct shot on that position even if you're right. It's shielded by that entire ridge." "A direct shot is not required," Vance said. She walked over to a secondary console, one that monitored the base's most esoteric piece of hardware. It was a weapon system that had been delivered a month prior, a prototype designated the XM4 Cerberus. It was a long-range static railgun emplacement, capable of firing a solid tungsten penetrator at hypersonic velocities. It was considered experimental, a weapon for a different kind of war, and Thorne had treated it as little more than a piece of useless, high-tech junk. "The Cerberus platform. I need it," she said. It was not a request. It was a command. The room was silent, caught between the abject failure of their commander and the impossible certainty of the woman they had dismissed as a rookie. It was Sergeant Marcus Cole, the veteran NCO in charge of the base's sensor arrays, who broke the spell. He had watched Vance work for weeks, had seen the quiet intensity of her focus. He had seen the way her predictions about minor tremors and weather patterns had come true with unnerving accuracy. He looked from Thorne's crumbling facade to Vance's unshakable calm. He made a choice. "I'm with her," Cole said, his voice firm. He moved to stand by Vance's side. "Her data has been solid, more solid than anything else we've got right now." That was it, the turn. Authority did not need to be seized. It simply flowed like water to the vessel capable of holding it. One by one, other technicians and soldiers turned their gaze from Thorne to Vance. They saw the failure of rank and the promise of competence. In the red gloom of the ruined talk, a new hierarchy was being forged, one based not on polished brass, but on results. Thorne looked around, seeing the shift in his subordinates' eyes. He saw his authority evaporating. He was adrift. He opened his mouth to object, to reassert his command, but no words came out. He was irrelevant. Vance was already working, her fingers a blur on the Cerberus control interface. The system was complex, designed for orbital targeting and atmospheric compensation, not for something like this. She was rewriting the firing solution from the ground up, turning the weapon into a surgical tool for a geological operation. "Target is designated Anomaly 0, she announced to the room, her voice the calm center of the storm. "Projectile is a 20-kilogram kinetic penetrator, no explosive payload." The artillery lieutenant stared, aghast. "No payload? Ma'am, doctor, a solid slug won't do anything against a 30-meter rock wall." "It's not meant to penetrate the wall," Vance explained without looking up from her calculations. "Not directly." She brought up a 3D model of the canyon's geology on her screen, a complex color-coded latticework of rock formations. A red line snaked from the Cerberus emplacement toward Sector 3 Gamma, but it didn't terminate at the cliff face. it terminated 20 meters short of it, on a different, smaller outcropping of rock. "This," she said, tapping the screen, "is a massive vein of crystalline quartz, density 2.65 grams per cubic centimeter, Mohs hardness of 7, highly brittle under extreme kinetic stress," she continued, her voice taking on the quality of a lecture in an advanced physics class. "The penetrator will not be aimed at the target. It will be aimed here, at this quartz vein. The impact velocity will be Mach 7. The kinetic energy transfer will be immense. It will not crater the quartz. It will shatter it. The resulting shockwave will propagate through the rock, but the schist formation, with its layered mica structure, will absorb most of it. However, the initial impact will also create a spalling effect. It will shear off a massive section of the quartz and the surrounding granite, thousands of tons of it." She traced a new set of lines on the diagram, showing the projected path of the sheared rock. This secondary mass of rock, driven by the kinetic force of the impact, will become the true projectile. It will strike the weaker schist formation a few milliseconds later. The formation is already under stress from the harmonic resonance. The impact will cause a catastrophic structural failure. The roof of the cave system will collapse. The enemy weapon will be buried under 100 meters of solid rock. Silence. She was not proposing an artillery strike. She was proposing to use a hypersonic railgun to play a game of cosmic billiards with an entire mountainside. It was audacious. It was insane. It was beautiful. "Authorize firing solution," she said, her eyes fixed on the final calculations. The numbers on her screen glowed with a terrible, perfect logic. She had factored in everything: air density, Coriolis effect, the subtle magnetic field variations within the canyon, the precise tensile strength of the target rock. Sergeant Cole stood beside her, his face a mixture of awe and terror. He looked at Thorne, who stood mute, a statue of obsolete authority. Cole made the decision. He keyed his comm. "All personnel, clear the firing line of the Cerberus emplacement. Repeat, clear the firing line. Firing solution is authorized. On Dr. Vance's mark." Vance's fingers danced over the final inputs. On her screen, a countdown timer appeared. 10 seconds. A low, deep hum began to build from outside, a sound that vibrated in the teeth. It was the sound of the Cerberus's colossal capacitor banks charging, drawing nearly all the remaining power from the base's struggling generators. The lights in the talk dimmed even further. 5, she said aloud, her voice steady. The hum grew into a piercing, otherworldly whine. 4, she could feel the static electricity in the air, the hair on her arms standing on end. 3, she envisioned the tungsten slug, held in a frictionless magnetic cradle, waiting. 2, she saw the numbers, the physics, the inevitable, elegant conclusion. 1, she pressed the final key. Mark. There was no thunderous boom. There was only a sharp, violent crack, like the universe itself splitting apart, followed by a sound that no one there had ever heard before. The sonic boom of an object moving at 7 times the speed of sound, a sound so fast it arrived after the event itself. For an instant, the air outside the talk seemed to shimmer, warped by the passage of the projectile. And then, silence. A profound, absolute silence that was deeper and more complete than anything they had experienced before. The distant crackle of the fires seemed to have been swallowed by it. The hum of the generator was gone. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Seconds stretched into an eternity. Everyone in the talk was frozen, listening to the silence, waiting for the retaliatory strike that would end them. Vance's eyes were on her seismic sensor display. She watched the data stream. There was the massive spike of the Cerberus firing. A few milliseconds later, a slightly smaller spike as the projectile struck the quartz vein 5 kilometers away. And then, a new signature. A low-frequency, high-amplitude rumble. It wasn't an explosion. It was the unmistakable sound of a massive, grinding collapse. The sound of a mountain falling in on itself. The rumble continued for a full minute, a deep, subterranean groan that seemed to come from the very foundations of the world. And then it, too, faded into silence. Vance looked at the display, at the place where the enemy's harmonic resonance signature had been. There was nothing, just the clean, steady line of the canyon's deep, natural hum. The ghost had been exorcised. The threat was neutralized. She leaned back in her chair, the tension leaving her in a slow, controlled exhale. The checkmate had been delivered. The problem was solved. The silence in the talk was finally broken by a single choked sob of relief from one of the younger technicians. Sergeant Cole let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for a lifetime. He looked at Vance, his eyes wide with a reverence that bordered on fear. "God Almighty," he whispered. He wasn't swearing. It was a prayer. Major Thorne simply stared at the paper map on the wall, at the small, innocuous circle Vance had drawn over Sector 3 Gamma. He looked at her, then back at the map. The entire framework of his reality, a world built on firepower, rank, and aggression, had been dismantled by a quiet woman with a knowledge of rocks. He looked broken. Just then, a new sound intruded. The crackle of a high-priority comm channel, patched through on a backup system. A voice, crisp and clear, filled the room. It was a voice that radiated an authority that made Thorne's previous bluster seem like a child's tantrum. "Nightingale talk. This is General Madsen, High Command. Report status. Over." Thorne seemed to shrink. He fumbled for the handset, his hand shaking. "General, this is Major Thorne. We were under attack, a new form of enemy artillery. We sustained heavy damage, but the threat has been neutralized." He was trying to reassert control, to frame the narrative in a way that preserved some shred of his command. "I'm aware of the attack, Major," Madsen's voice replied, a cold edge to it. "I've been monitoring the situation through a back-channel link. I'm also aware that your conventional response was a catastrophic failure that resulted in multiple casualties and the near loss of the entire facility. What I want to know is who authorized the use of the Cerberus platform." Thorne hesitated. His eyes flickered towards Vance. This was his moment. He could try to take credit, or he could throw her to the wolves for using an experimental weapon without his direct, coherent command. "General," he began, his voice slick with a desperate political calculation. "The situation was chaotic. Specialist Vance acted unilaterally. She fired the weapon on a hunch." "Enough, Kalen," the general's voice cut through him like a surgeon's scalpel. The use of his first name was a stunning rebuke, a public stripping of his rank. "I'm not talking to you. Put Dr. Vance on the line." The word hung in the air. Doctor, not specialist, not geologist. Doctor. Sergeant Cole handed the receiver to Vance. Thorne watched, his face ashen, as she took it. Her expression was unchanged. She was as calm now in victory as she had been under fire. "Vance here," she said simply. "Ilara," the general's voice was warmer now, filled with a respect that was utterly absent when he spoke to Thorne. "Report. Did the geoballistic solution perform as predicted?" Geoballistic, another new term. a concept so far beyond the understanding of anyone else in the room that it might as well have been magic. "It did, General," Vance replied. "The spalling cascade was effective. The secondary kinetic transfer caused a full structural collapse of the cave system. The harmonic signature of the enemy weapon ceased at the moment of impact. I assess a 100% probability of target neutralization." "Excellent. The doctrine is proven then. Your work there is done." There was a pause. "Major Thorne," the general's voice was once again like chips of ice. "You are to be confined to your quarters. You are relieved of command of FOB Nightingale, effective immediately. Sergeant Cole will assume temporary command until your replacement arrives. A full inquiry into your performance will follow. You have endangered one of this command's most valuable assets and nearly derailed a project of critical strategic importance. Do you understand me, Major?" Thorne stood there, the handset still dangling from his hand, his mouth opening and closing silently. He didn't seem to be breathing. The public humiliation was total. His fall from power was not just swift, it was an amputation. He finally managed a single, choked word. "Yes." "Good," Madsen said. "Dr. Vance, your transport will be there at 0600. Well done. Madsen out." The channel went silent. The revelation settled over the room, recontextualizing everything they had witnessed. Vance wasn't a civilian contractor attached to their unit. They were the attachment. The entire forward operating base, this fortress in the middle of nowhere, hadn't been a strategic outpost. It had been her laboratory. They were the control group, the conventional military element against which her radical new science of warfare was being tested. She hadn't been an outsider looking in. They had been. They were the background characters in her story. The arrogant commander, the loyal subordinate, the faceless soldiers, all just data points in her grand experiment. The enemy's attack hadn't been a crisis. It had been the final exam, and she had passed. The new order established itself not with a bang, but with a quiet, efficient hum. Under Sergeant Cole's temporary command, the base began the work of recovery. Damage control teams moved with a renewed sense of purpose. The wounded were tended to, the fires were extinguished. There was no cheering, no celebration of their impossible victory. There was only a quiet, pervasive sense of awe. Soldiers who had once mocked the rock collector now gave Vance a wide berth, their eyes filled with a mixture of respect and fear. They looked at her as if she were not quite human, as if she might at any moment calculate the precise tensile strength of their bones and the exact kinetic force required to break them. She had become a legend in the space of a single 5,000-meter shot. The quiet professional, the ghost who hunted ghosts. Vance herself showed no pleasure in her victory, no satisfaction in Thorne's downfall. The outcome had been a matter of calculation, not emotion. The humbling of the major was merely the removal of a malfunctioning variable from the system. She returned to her console, sifting through the post-impact data, her focus as absolute as ever. The collapse of the cave had revealed new geological strata, and she was already absorbing the information, refining her models, preparing for the next problem. The next morning, as the twin suns began to bake the canyon floor, Sergeant Cole approached her alcove. He did not offer praise or congratulations. He understood, on an intuitive level, that such things were meaningless to her. Instead, he placed a steaming mug of coffee on her desk. It was a simple, profound gesture of respect, an acknowledgement from one professional to another. "Doctor," he said, his voice low, "that quartz vein, you knew it was there. It wasn't on any of our scans. Vance took a sip of the coffee. It was black, bitter, perfect. She looked up from her screen, her gray eyes meeting his. The angle of solar reflection off the cliff face at 1400 hours showed a polarized anomaly consistent with a high concentration of crystalline silica, she said. And the runoff from the last rainstorm had a mineral content that confirmed it. I didn't need a scan. The mountain told me it was there. Cole just nodded slowly, a deep understanding dawning in his eyes. She didn't just have better technology. She saw a different world, a world of data and subtle signs that was invisible to everyone else. She read the landscape like a book written in a language only she knew. An hour later, a sleek, unmarked transport craft descended into the heart of the base, its engines whispering where a normal chopper would have roared. It settled onto the landing pad with barely a puff of dust. Its ramp lowered, revealing a stark, empty interior. It was time for her to leave. She gathered no belongings. Her work was data, and it was already uploaded to a secure network. She walked across the dusty compound, a solitary figure in her nondescript fatigues. The soldiers stopped what they were doing to watch her pass. They did not salute. She had no rank. They simply watched, their faces grim and respectful. They were watching a force of nature depart. Her purpose fulfilled, she disappeared as quietly as she had arrived. She left behind a cratered perimeter, a broken commander, and a legend whispered in hushed tones in the mess hall. The story of the quiet geologist who had defeated an army with a rock. She was a new kind of soldier for a new kind of war. A war fought not with bullets and bombs, but with data and physics. She was not a warrior in the traditional sense. She was a living weapon, a human manifestation of logic in a world governed by chaos and ego. Her legacy would not be written in medals or citations, but in the silent, shattered stone of the Xylos Canyon, a permanent monument to the day that competence became the only rank that mattered. And somewhere else, in another valley, another desert, another impossible battlefield, a new problem was waiting. And she would be there, listening to the secrets the world was willing to tell, ready to solve it.